The heat shimmered off the dust of Cedar Falls's main street, a lazy mirage that promised water where there was only grit. For Jack Morrison, it was just another Tuesday. Another trip into town for salt flour and the blessed silence that came with minding his own business. His ranch was his sanctuary, a self-imposed exile where the ghosts of his past were kept at bay by the rhythm of hard work and the vast, empty sky. He tied his horse, a stoic roan named Dust Devil, to the hitching post outside the general store and tipped his hat to the sun, a gesture of weary respect for its relentless power. Inside the First National Bank, Sarah Cooper was counting out coins, her brow furrowed in concentration. The teller, a young man with more ambition than sense, was explaining the complexities of interest rates, while her 5 children waited near the door, a restless constellation of innocence in the staid, quiet room. 12-year-old Mary held the baby Joseph, her expression a careful imitation of adult seriousness. 10-year-old Samuel stood with his arms crossed, trying to look bored, but failing to hide the anxious way he scanned the street. 8-year-old Ruth was tracing patterns in the floor dust with the toe of her worn-out boot, while the 6-year-old twins, David and Daniel, engaged in a silent wrestling match that only their mothers seemed oblivious to. Jack was across the street negotiating the price of barbed wire when the world fractured. It began not with a bang, but with a sudden, violent shove. 2 men, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, burst through the bank's double doors. One carried a shotgun, the other a Colt Peacemaker that looked too big for his trembling hand. Nobody moved. The one with the pistol shrieked, his voice cracking like a boy's. Glass shattered. A woman screamed. Jack's blood went cold. He didn't think. He reacted. Years of training, long dormant but never forgotten, took over. He dove for cover behind a water trough, the scent of gunpowder thick and acrid in his throat. The world slowed to a crawl, each detail etched in terrifying clarity. He saw the clumsy fear in the robbers' movements, the wide-eyed panic of the townsfolk frozen in place. He saw Sarah Cooper instinctively push her children behind her, her body becoming a shield. It was a mistake. A hero's mistake. The kind of mistake Jack had made once before, a lifetime ago. The memory hit him like a physical blow, a ghost image of another town, another shootout, another woman standing between danger and her child. His wife, his little girl. The scent of gunpowder was the same. The sound of a woman's scream was the same. The sickening thud of a body hitting the floor. That was the same too. A stray bullet fired not from malice, but from pure panicked incompetence by the boy with the Peacemaker, ricocheted off the brass teller cage. It tore through the air with a venomous whine and found Sarah Cooper's side. She crumpled without a sound, a marionette with its strings cut. The robbers, horrified by what they had done, scooped up a single bag of money and fled firing wildly into the air as they galloped out of town. The chaos they left behind was a vacuum of stunned silence, a heavy blanket that smothered the town. But Jack could hear the screaming. It was inside his head. He was back in San Saba 10 years ago, a Texas Ranger with a reputation and a family he adored. A shootout gone wrong, a tactical error, his error, a ricochet that had stolen the world from him. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs let in his heart, a stone in his chest. He stumbled across the street and into the bank, pushing past the frozen onlookers. The children were huddled around their mother, their small cries like the sounds of wounded birds. Mary was trying to staunch the bleeding with a piece of her dress, her face a mask of desperate denial. Jack knelt beside Sarah. He knew the wound was fatal. He had seen too many like it. Her eyes, hazy with pain, found his. There was no fear in them, only a fierce primal urgency. "My children," she gasped, her breath catching on a bubble of blood. "Please, Samuel. Mary, promise me. Her hand, slick with her own lifeblood, reached for his. Jack took it, his grip surprisingly gentle. Her fingers were cold. He looked from her pleading eyes to the 5 terrified faces staring down at them, and he saw the ghosts of his own lost family. A son he would never have, a daughter he could never hold again. Redemption wasn't something he believed in. Forgiveness was a fairy tale for other men. But in that moment, staring into the face of a dying mother, he felt the crushing weight of a debt he didn't know how to repay. I promise, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Sarah's eyes fluttered closed. A single final sigh escaped her lips. And then she was gone. The silence she left behind was absolute, broken only by the heartbroken sobs of her children. Sheriff Miles Barnes arrived moments later, moving with a cold efficiency that bordered on indifference. He surveyed the scene, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second too long on Jack kneeling in the pool of blood. "Morrison," he said, his voice flat, "trouble seems to find you, doesn't it?" Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. He was still in San Saba, still holding a hand that had grown cold too soon. He felt a small tug on his sleeve. It was Ruth, her face streaked with tears and grime. Is she sleeping?" the little girl whispered. Jack looked at the 5 orphaned faces, their worlds shattered, their futures a terrifying blank. He had made a promise. And Jack Morrison, for all his sins, had never broken a promise. He looked up at Sheriff Barnes, whose eyes held a strange, knowing glint, and felt the first stirrings of a new kind of war. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a beginning. The sun beat down on Cedar Falls, bleaching the color from the clapboard buildings until they looked as weary as the townsfolk. The Cooper children sat in the dust of Main Street, a small island of grief in a sea of indifference. People walked past them as if they were invisible. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house crossed to the other side of the street, her lips pursed in disapproval. Tom Bradley, who owned half the town, stepped over David's outstretched legs without a glance. They were an inconvenience, a problem someone else would have to solve. Jack watched from the shade of the general store's awning, a silent sentinel. He had spent the last 2 hours answering Sheriff Barnes's questions, his answers clipped and terse. He described the robbery the stray shot, Sarah's final moments. He left out the promise. That was private. That was his alone. Barnes had listened, his expression unreadable, before dismissing him with a wave of his hand. "We'll handle it, Morrison. The county will make arrangements." Jack knew what arrangements meant. A bleak, underfunded orphanage in Millfield, a place where children were lost, their spirits broken by neglect and cruelty. The 5 Cooper children would be separated, scattered like seeds on barren ground. The thought settled like a stone in his gut. He saw Samuel trying to stand tall, his bird-thin arms wrapped around his younger siblings. He saw Mary rocking the baby, her young face etched with a pain no child should ever know. He saw his own failure reflected in their eyes. If he hadn't frozen, if the ghosts of San Saba hadn't paralyzed him for those crucial seconds, could he have done something? A warning shot, a distraction? It didn't matter. What was done was done. All that mattered was the promise. He pushed himself off the wall and walked toward them, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. The children flinched as his shadow fell over them. "You children got names?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Mary looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "I'm Mary," she said, her voice a whisper. "This is Samuel, Ruth, the twins David and Daniel. And this is Joseph." She clutched the baby tighter, a tiny lioness protecting her pride. Jack nodded, his gaze sweeping over each of them. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest. My name's Jack Morrison. I have a ranch a few miles north of here." He paused, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "I made your mother a promise." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "What promise?" "To look after you," Jack said simply. "To see that you're safe." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Mary stared at him, searching his weathered face for a trick, a lie. Kindness like this didn't exist in their world. Kindness had a price, and they had nothing left to pay with. Why, she asked, the single word encompassing all her fear and suspicion. Jack's gaze drifted to the horizon, to the hazy line where the plains met the sky. "Because I owe a debt," he said, more to himself than to them. "And because no child should have to face the world alone." He stood up, his decision made. "Come with me, all of you. There's food at my place, clean beds. It's not much, but it's safe." He started to turn, expecting them to follow, but a voice stopped him. A voice laced with false politeness that barely concealed its venom. "Hold on there, Morrison." Sheriff Barnes stood not 10 feet away, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Mighty charitable of you. But these children are now wards of the state. It's a legal matter." Jack faced him, his body tensing. "They're children who need a roof over their head, Miles. It's a human matter." Barnes chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "Always the saint, aren't you, trying to save the world one stray at a time?" His eyes flickered with something dark and ancient. "But some debts can never be repaid, can they, Jack? Some mistakes follow a man forever." The cryptic words hung in the air, a clear reference to a past Jack wanted to keep buried. Barnes was drawing a line in the sand, and the Cooper children were standing right in the middle of it. "They're coming with me," Jack said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I don't think so," Barnes countered, his hand drifting casually toward the Colt at his hip. "I have a duty to see they're processed through the proper channels. For their own good, of course." Jack took a step forward, and the carefully constructed piece of Cedar Falls threatened to shatter. The few townsfolk still lingering on the street began to back away, sensing the simmering violence. But before either man could make another move, Mary spoke, her voice clear and strong. "We'll go with Mr. Morrison," she said. She stood up, baby Joseph cradled in one arm, and faced the sheriff. "He made a promise to our mother." Barnes's smirk faltered. He hadn't counted on the children having a voice. He looked from Mary's determined face to Jack's unyielding stance, and a flicker of frustration crossed his features. "This isn't over, Morrison," he hissed, his voice low enough for only Jack to hear. "I'll be in touch." He turned and strode away, his boots clicking a sharp, angry rhythm on the boardwalk. Jack watched him go, a cold certainty settling in his soul. This was just the beginning. Barnes wouldn't let this go. He had been given a weapon to use against Jack, and he intended to use it. He turned back to the children. 5 pairs of eyes stared up at him, a mixture of hope, fear, and utter exhaustion. He had saved them from the street, but he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had just led them into a much more dangerous storm. "Come on," he said, his voice softer now. "Let's go home." The Morrison Ranch was a testament to solitude. A small, sturdy house built of cottonwood and stone stood against the vast, empty prairie, a lonely sentinel under an endless sky. The wind, a constant presence, carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. For the children, it was like landing on another planet. The silence was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the constant noise of town. Jack's home was Spartan and relentlessly clean. A single main room served as kitchen, dining room, and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantelpiece bare except for a single faded photograph in a wooden frame. It showed a smiling woman, with Jack's eyes and a little girl on her lap. Mary noticed that Jack never looked at it. The first few days were a blur of awkward adjustments. Jack was a man of few words, more comfortable with the silent language of livestock and land than with the complex needs of grieving children. His attempts at comfort were gruff and practical. He cooked enormous meals of beef stew and beans, ensuring their plates were never empty. He found old blankets and made up beds for them on the floor near the fire. He showed Mary where to find the well and how to work the pump, and he set Samuel to the task of mending a section of broken fence, his instructions short and to the point. Wire goes here. Pull it tight. Don't cut yourself. The children, in turn, were wary and watchful. They spoke in whispers, moved through the house like ghosts, and huddled together for comfort. Ruth drew pictures in the dirt outside, endless drawings of a woman with a smiling face. The twins followed Samuel everywhere, their identical faces masks of silent observation. Mary took charge of Joseph, tending to him with a fierce maternal focus that left little room for her own grief. It was Sheriff Barnes who shattered the fragile peace. He arrived 4 days later, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over the porch like a shroud. He didn't bother to knock, simply dismounted and stood there, his hands on his hips, a sheaf of official-looking papers in his hand. Jack met him on the porch. "What do you want, Barnes?" Barnes smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his face. "Just delivering the mail, Morrison. This is a court order. It declares you an unfit guardian." Jack took the papers, his knuckles white. The legal jargon swam before his eyes, but the meaning was brutally clear. It cited his mysterious past, his unstable temperament, and his lack of familial connections. It was a character assassination, painted in the bland ink of the law. "This is garbage," Jack growled, crumpling the paper in his fist. "It's a legally binding document," Barnes said smoothly. "It gives me the authority to remove these children and place them in the state orphanage in Millfield. For their own protection, of course." He let the threat hang in the air, a poisoned dart aimed straight at Jack's heart. Unless what Jack demanded, though, he already knew there would be a price. Barnes's gaze drifted past Jack toward the creek that snaked through the property, the lifeblood of the ranch. "I hear the railroad is looking to buy up land along Black Creek. They need the water rights. A man who controlled those rights could make himself very useful, very powerful." He paused, his eyes locking with Jack's. "Sign over the water rights to your ranch, to the county, for the public good, naturally. And I might be persuaded that these children are better off here under my supervision." The blackmail was so blatant, so audacious, it took Jack's breath away. Barnes didn't just want to hurt him. He wanted to ruin him. He wanted to take his land, his water, the very source of his independence, and leave him broken. The children were just leverage. "You'll get nothing from me." Jack said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. Barnes's smile widened. "Then you'll lose everything else. I'll give you 24 hours to think it over, Morrison. By this time tomorrow, either I have the deed to your water rights, or I have 5 orphans to deliver to Millfield." He tipped his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy. "Your choice." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Jack standing on the porch, the crumpled court order in his hand, and the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on him. He could feel the children's eyes on him from inside the house. They had heard everything. That night, the silence in the small house was different. It was no longer awkward. It was terrified. Jack sat by the fire, staring into the flames and the ghosts of his past swirling in the smoke. He had run from his life, from the man he used to be hiding on this ranch, in the hopes that his sins would fade with time. But Barnes had found him. He had dragged Jack's past into the present and was using it to threaten his future. He felt a small presence beside him. It was Samuel. The boy didn't speak, just stood there, his small shoulders squared. "He can't take us, can he?" Samuel asked, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound brave. "You won't let him?" Jack looked at the boy, at the desperate hope in his eyes, and felt something shift inside him. For 10 years he had been running. For 10 years he had been paying a solitary penance for his failure. But now his penance had a face. It had 5 faces. He couldn't protect his own family, but by God, he would protect this one. The quiet rancher was gone. The man he had been before, the man who knew how to fight, was stirring from his long sleep. "No, son," Jack said, his hand resting on Samuel's shoulder. "I won't let him." The next morning, Jack rode into town, not with a deed, but with a purpose. He went to see Doc Miller, a man whose friendship predated Jack's self-imposed exile. The doctor was old, cantankerous, and one of the few people who knew the vague outlines of Jack's past. He listened grimly as Jack explained Barnes's ultimatum. "The man's a snake." Miller grunted, wiping his spectacles on his sleeve. "Always has been. He's got the town council in his pocket, bought and paid for by railroad money. But a court order from a territorial judge, that's another matter. You need a lawyer." "I need leverage," Jack corrected him. "Something to use against him. There has to be something in his past, some inconsistency in his records." While the doctor began discreetly asking questions among his patients, Jack started his own investigation. He spent hours poring over old county records, land deeds, and sheriff's reports at the courthouse. He discovered that Barnes had acquired several large parcels of land under questionable circumstances, always just before a new business or the railroad expressed interest. It was a pattern of corruption, but it was circumstantial. Nothing solid enough to challenge a court order. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, a fragile transformation was taking place. Knowing Jack was fighting for them, the children began to shed their shells of fear. Mary, with quiet competence, took over the management of the kitchen, turning Jack's simple supplies into savory meals. She organized the household, her natural maturity blossoming now that she had a foundation to build on. Jack, in turn, began to see them not as a burden or a debt, but as individuals. He taught Samuel how to properly saddle a horse, his gruff instructions softening with patience when the boy fumbled with the straps. He discovered that Ruth had a remarkable talent for drawing, and he surprised her one evening with a set of charcoal pencils he'd bought in town. He even managed to make the twins laugh by carving them small, lopsided wooden horses. He was slowly, reluctantly building a family. The gaping wound in his soul, the one left by the loss of his wife and daughter, was still there. But for the first time in a decade, it didn't feel quite so empty. The deadline Barnes had set came and went. The sheriff didn't appear at the ranch, a clear sign that he was enjoying the psychological game, letting the threat of the orphanage hang over their heads. Jack knew it was a temporary reprieve. Barnes was building his case, gathering his power, preparing for his final move. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Doc Miller, making a late-night house call, mentioned the bank robbery in passing. Strangest thing, he'd mused. Those boys were amateurs, terrified. A professional would never have been so clumsy. And they only grabbed one bag, left 2 more sitting on the counter. Doesn't make sense. The comment sparked something in Jack's memory. The shooter's cracking voice, the panicked incompetence. It hadn't been a robbery. It had been a performance, a staged event designed for a specific outcome. Sarah Cooper's death hadn't been an accident. It had been the goal. Someone had wanted her dead to create 5 orphans, 5 pieces of leverage. The realization was a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about land or money. This was personal. This was about him. That night, fueled by a cold, simmering rage, Jack broke into the sheriff's office. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty street. He moved with a stealth he hadn't used in years, the skills of his former life returning as if they had never left. He wasn't looking for land deeds anymore. He was looking for proof of a deeper conspiracy. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. He rifled through the filing cabinets, finding nothing but the mundane paperwork of a small-town lawman. Frustrated, he ran his hands along the wooden paneling of the walls, searching for anything out of place. His fingers found a loose board behind a framed map of the territory. He pried it open. Inside was a small, locked metal box. Using the blade of his knife, he forced the lock. His heart pounded in his chest as he lifted the lid. It didn't contain documents or money. It contained memories. A woman's silver locket tarnished with age, a dried flower pressed between two pieces of glass, and at the bottom a faded photograph. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The world tilted on its axis. The photograph showed two young men in the crisp, proud uniform of the Texas Rangers. They stood side by side, grinning at the camera. One was a younger, happier version of himself. The other was Miles Barnes. Standing next to Barnes, her hand on his arm, was a beautiful woman, holding a little girl with bright, laughing eyes. On the back, written in elegant script, was a date and a location, San Saba, 10 years ago. San Saba, the town where his world had ended, the town where his wife and daughter had died in a shootout he had led. He had never known Barnes was there that day. He'd been a junior ranger, then assigned to another squad. Suddenly, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The stray bullet that had killed his family had come from the crossfire. He had always blamed himself, his tactical error that put them in the line of fire. But what if Barnes blamed him too? What if Barnes's family had also been lost in that same hail of bullets? The cryptic remarks, the relentless persecution, the staged robbery that had so perfectly mirrored his own tragedy. This wasn't about water rights. It was never about the railroad. It was about revenge. A cold, patient, 10-year-long vendetta. Barnes hadn't just stumbled upon an opportunity to hurt him. He had orchestrated the entire thing, from Sarah Cooper's death to the legal threats, all to systematically destroy Jack's life and take away his newfound family, just as he believed Jack had taken away his. The fight wasn't for land. It was for a ghost. And Jack was standing in the crosshairs. The knowledge settled in Jack's soul, cold and heavy as a tombstone. He was no longer just a protector, he was a target. And the 5 children sleeping peacefully back at the ranch were sleeping in the path of an avalanche. He replaced the box, slipped out of the office, and melted back into the night. But the image of the photograph burned into his mind. The rules of the game had changed. The pretense was over. He knew Barnes's secret, and he suspected Barnes would know he knew. The quiet war of legal threats and intimidation was about to become a very real, very deadly conflict. The storm broke the next day. Not in the sky, but on the ground. Barnes, realizing his secret was out, abandoned all subtlety. He rode out to the ranch, not alone this time, but with 2 grim-faced deputies. He didn't come with threats, he came with a warrant. Jack Morrison. He announced, his voice ringing with false authority. "You're under arrest for the robbery of the First National Bank." He held up a canvas bag. "We found this buried near your creek, full of the stolen money." It was a clumsy frame-up, but in a town controlled by Barnes, it was enough. The deputies drew their guns. The children who had been playing in the yard froze in terror. "It's a lie," Jack said calmly, his eyes never leaving Barnes's. He was calculating, thinking. Barnes wanted him in a cell out of the way, so he could get to the children. "Tell it to the judge," Barnes sneered. take him. As the deputies moved to grab him, Jack saw a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. A third man, someone he hadn't seen before, was circling around the side of the house toward the back, where Ruth was tending to a small vegetable patch Mary had started. It was a diversion, a trap. "Ruth," Jack roared. The little girl looked up confused just as the man snatched her. She let out a single terrified scream before his hand clamped over her mouth. "No," Mary shrieked, starting to run towards her sister, but one of the deputies leveled his gun at her. "Stay put, girl." Everything happened at once. Jack lunged not at Barnes, but at the deputy closest to him, disarming him with a brutal efficiency that spoke of his past. He used the man as a shield, shoving him into the other deputy as he dove for the meager cover of the porch. A shot rang out, splintering the wood next to his head. Barnes just laughed a terrible, triumphant sound. The man holding Ruth dragged her onto the back of his horse and galloped away, disappearing over the rise. Barnes and his deputies mounted up, keeping their guns trained on Jack. "It's over, Morrison," Barnes called out. "Your move is to rot in a cell. Mine is to take the rest of them." But Jack saw the small piece of paper flutter to the ground where the third man had stood. A note. Barnes wanted more than just to take the children. He wanted a final confrontation. He wanted to make Jack watch. As Barnes and his men wheeled their horses around to follow, Jack made his choice. He couldn't save Ruth from a jail cell. He threw the empty, disarmed pistol he'd taken from the deputy onto the ground in a gesture of surrender. "All right," he said, raising his hands. "You win." For a moment, Barnes looked surprised, then his face broke into a victorious smirk. He had broken Jack Morrison. Or so he thought. Later that afternoon, after a tense and silent ride back to town and a brief farcical arraignment, Doc Miller came to the jail. He slipped Jack a key he'd borrowed from a sleeping deputy. "Barnes has the other 4 kids locked in the church with Father McKenna for safekeeping," the doctor whispered through the bars. "He's telling everyone you're a dangerous fugitive. He's left a skeleton crew in town. The rest rode out with him. What's his game, Jack?" Jack looked at his old friend, his face a grim mask. "He's not finished. He wants to finish it where it all began for him." He had read the note before the deputies had taken him. The scrawled words were burned into his memory. "Black Creek Silver Mine. Dusk. Come alone or the girl pays for your sins." The Black Creek Mine was a collapsed and forgotten relic, a gaping wound in the earth rumored to be unstable and haunted. A perfect place for a final tragic act. "Get the children out of the church," Doc Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "Take them somewhere safe, somewhere Barnes would never think to look. Then get word to a few good men. Men you can trust. Tell them to meet me a mile south of the mine. But tell them to wait for my signal. I have to go in alone first." As dusk began to bleed across the prairie, turning the sky to shades of bruised purple and blood orange, Jack Morrison slipped out of his cell. He was no longer a quiet rancher. He was a man with nothing left to lose, on his way to a showdown that had been 10 years in the making. The wind picked up, howling like a grieving woman, and the first drops of a cold, hard rain began to fall. A storm was coming both in the heavens and in the heart of the earth. The Black Creek Silver Mine clung to the side of the canyon like a dying beast, its skeletal wooden structures groaning under the assault of the rising storm. Rain fell in cold driving sheets, turning the ground to slick red mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the desolate landscape in stark, epileptic flashes, followed by the deep, guttural roar of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. Jack moved through the downpour like a wraith, his face set in stone. He carried a rifle scavenged from the sheriff's office and a resolve forged in grief and rage. He left Dust Devil tied in a sheltered cove a mile back, where Doc Miller and a small posse of ranchers were waiting for his signal, a single rifle shot, if he could manage it. But he knew this was a confrontation he had to face alone first. This was his debt to pay. The entrance to the mine was a dark, yawning maw that smelled of wet rock and decay. A single lantern cast a flickering, sickly yellow light from within. Jack slipped inside his boots, silent on the damp earth. The tunnel was shored up with rotting timbers, and water trickled down the walls, forming a steady stream on the floor that snaked deeper into the darkness. He followed the light and the sound of voices. In a larger cavern lit by several lanterns, he found them. Sheriff Barnes stood with his back to a thick wooden pillar, a shotgun cradled in his arms. Ruth was tied to the same pillar, her small face pale with terror, a dirty gag silencing her cries. "I knew you'd come," Barnes said without turning around. His voice was unnaturally calm. "A man like you can't resist a chance to play the hero." "Let her go, Barnes," Jack said, his voice echoing in the cavern. "This is between you and me." Barnes turned slowly, and the face Jack saw in the lantern light was not that of a corrupt lawman, but of a man hollowed out by a decade of hate. His eyes burned with a feverish intensity. "It was always between you and me, Jack. She's just a piece on the board. An important one, I'll admit. Just like my Emily was." The name hit Jack with the force of a physical blow. Emily. That was the name of Barnes's daughter in the photograph. San Saba, Jack stated the name, tasting like poison. A flicker of something pain memory madness crossed Barnes's face. "You remember. I've wondered if you did. You with your celebrated career, your reputation. Did you ever spare a thought for the collateral damage, for the families shattered by your recklessness?" He took a step forward, the shotgun never wavering. "My wife Sarah was buying ribbons for Emily's hair. Emily was 6. She had just learned to read. They were walking past the saloon when your grand shootout erupted. Your shot went wide, Jack. It missed your target, but it drew their fire. A spray of bullets. They never stood a chance." The confession, raw and filled with a grief so profound, it had curdled into insanity, hung in the damp air. This was the truth Jack had never known. The ricochet that killed his own family was only part of the story. His single mistake had caused a cascade of death. "I didn't know," Jack whispered the words wholly inadequate. "You didn't care to know," Barnes roared, his composure finally cracking. "You were transferred, promoted. You buried your grief and moved on. I stayed. I buried my wife and my daughter in a town that reeked of your failure. I found your file. I learned you'd lost your family too. And I swore on their graves that one day you would feel exactly what I felt. The loss of a new family. The hope of a second chance ripped away before your very eyes." A sound from the shadows behind Barnes made Jack's blood run cold. A figure stepped into the light, holding a rifle. It was a young man, barely 20, his face gaunt, and his eyes filled with a bitter, misplaced righteousness. "He told me you let my pa die," the young man said, his voice shaking. "He said you were a coward who ran." Jack stared at him, recognition dawning with sickening certainty. It was the face of a boy he'd once known, now hardened by loss and poisoned by lies. Tommy Henderson. The young man flinched. "My name is Luke. Tommy died the day my pa did. Barnes found me. He told me the truth about you. How you were responsible for the mine collapse that killed my father. How you adopted me out of guilt only to cast me aside. He's lying to you, son." Jack said, his mind racing. Barnes hadn't just planned this. He had cultivated it, nurturing Luke's grief into a weapon. Your father's death was a tragic accident. I left Cedar Falls because the memories were too much. I never cast you aside. Lies, Luke screamed, leveling his rifle. A deep, groaning sound echoed from the depths of the mine. The steady trickle of water on the floor was now a rushing stream. The storm outside was funneling water into the old shafts. The ticking clock wasn't just the confrontation. It was the rising flood. It doesn't matter what he believes, Barnes said, a chilling smile on his face. He serves his purpose. He gestured with his shotgun toward Ruth. Now you have a choice, Jack. You can die quickly, or you can watch the girl drown as the mine fills up. Either way, my debt is paid. That's when Jack saw it. A faint shimmer in the air, near the ceiling of the cavern. A pocket of trapped gas leaking from an old vein. One stray spark, one gunshot could bring the entire cavern down. It was a terrible risk, but it was the only one he had. You're right, Miles, Jack said, slowly raising his rifle. Not at Barnes, but at the lantern hanging from a timber directly above him. The debt gets paid tonight. He fired. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and flame. A fraction of a second later, the gas ignited with a deafening whoomp. The cavern roof shuddered. Rock and dirt rained down. Luke cried out in alarm, stumbling backward. Barnes was thrown off balance, his shotgun discharging into the ceiling, bringing down a fresh cascade of debris that partially blocked the tunnel entrance. In the chaos of falling rock and sudden darkness, lit only by the remaining lantern near Ruth, Jack moved. He slammed into Luke, not with the intent to harm, but to disarm, knocking the rifle from his hands. He manipulated you, Luke. He used your grief. A torrent of muddy water released by the explosion from a blocked shaft surged into the cavern. It was already ankle-deep and rising fast. Barnes recovered his face, a mask of pure fury. He raised his shotgun again, but Jack was already moving, pulling Ruth's pillar with all his strength. The rotted wood groaned, then snapped at its base. Jack grabbed the terrified girl, cutting the ropes on her wrists with his knife. Get to high ground, he yelled at Luke, shoving him toward a ledge on the far side of the cavern. The water was at their knees, now cold and pulling with a deadly current. Jack half-carried, half-dragged Ruth toward the blocked entrance. Barnes stood in their path. A man possessed his face, illuminated by the single swaying lantern. You will not take this from me, he screamed over the roar of the floodwaters. Jack set Ruth behind him. Stay here. He walked toward Barnes, unarmed, his hands open at his sides. The water swirled around his waist. It's over, Miles. My family's gone. Your family's gone. More death won't bring them back. It just creates more ghosts. For a moment, he thought his words had reached the man buried beneath the monster. A flicker of doubt crossed Barnes's eyes. But it was fleeting. The hate was too deep, the wound too old. He leveled the shotgun at Jack's chest. From the ledge, Luke watched his face, a canvas of confusion and dawning horror. He saw not a coward, but a man willing to sacrifice himself. Before Barnes could pull the trigger, a section of the tunnel behind him, weakened by the flood, collapsed with a deafening roar. The torrent of water became a wave, knocking both men off their feet. Jack fought his way back to Ruth, grabbing her just as the last lantern was extinguished, plunging them into absolute roaring darkness. He held her tight, his body a shield against the debris-filled water, his only thought to keep her head above the surface. He had made a promise. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under the emerging sun. Jack carried Ruth out of the mouth of the mine, his body battered and bruised, but his spirit strangely calm. Luke stumbled out behind them, covered in mud, his face streaked with tears of shame and relief. He had helped Jack find a secondary air shaft, their only escape from the flooded tomb below. At the bottom of the canyon, Doc Miller and the ranchers were waiting. They had heard the explosion and the mine's collapse and had feared the worst. The sight of Jack and the children alive was met with a collective sigh of relief that seemed to echo through the canyon. Barnes' Doc Miller asked, his voice grave. Jack shook his head. The mine took him. There was no triumph in his voice, only a profound, weary sadness. Justice had been served not by a bullet, but by the earth itself. They returned to town to find the world changed. With Luke's testimony and the evidence Jack had uncovered in the sheriff's office, the depth of Barnes's corruption and his insane vendetta was laid bare. The town council, shamed into action, arrested the few deputies still loyal to him. The good people of Cedar Falls, who had once averted their eyes from the Cooper children, now rallied around them. Offers of help, food, and clothing poured in. The town, like the landscape, had been cleansed by the storm. The emotional reunion at the ranch was quiet and powerful. Mary Samuel and the twins ran to Jack, their arms wrapping around him, their tears soaking his shirt. He knelt and held them, all of them, in a fierce embrace. Ruth, safe and sound, clung to his hand. In their eyes, he was no longer just a protector. He was a father. He sat on the porch for a long time, watching them, feeling the jagged edges of his soul begin to smooth over. The ghosts of San Saba were still there, but they were quieter now, their angry whispers replaced by the gentle sounds of children's laughter. A few days later, Jack stood in the new sheriff's office facing a defeated Luke Henderson. The boy couldn't meet his eyes. "He told me you were a monster," Luke mumbled, staring at the floor. "He twisted my pa's memory, my grief. He made me hate you." Hate is a heavy burden to carry. "Son," Jack said, his voice devoid of judgment. "It poisons the man who carries it. Your father was a good man. He wouldn't want you living like this." He didn't press charges. He told the new sheriff that Luke was as much a victim as anyone. It was an act of grace that Luke didn't understand, but it planted a seed of hope in his barren heart. Weeks turned into a month. Life settled into a new peaceful rhythm. The adoption was finalized. The 5 Cooper children were now legally the 5 Morrison children. The ranch, once a haven of solitude, was now filled with the chaotic, vibrant energy of a real family. One clear autumn morning, Jack took them all to the small cemetery on the edge of town. They stood before 2 graves. One was a simple wooden cross for Sarah Cooper. The other was a small weathered stone that read, "Elizabeth and Anna Morrison, beloved wife and daughter." Jack knelt and placed a small polished silver locket on Sarah's grave, the one he'd recovered from Barnes's secret box. "This was hers," he said quietly to Mary. "She'd want you to have it when you're older." Then he turned to the other grave. For the first time, he spoke of them to the children. He told them about his Elizabeth, about her laugh that sounded like wind chimes, and about his little Anna, who had wanted a pony more than anything in the world. He didn't share the horror of their deaths, only the beauty of their lives. It wasn't a confession of guilt, but a sharing of love. He was bridging his 2 families, his past and his present. He stood there surrounded by his new children and felt a sense of peace he had thought was lost to him forever. He had found redemption not by forgetting his past, but by having the courage to build a new future upon its ruins. When they returned to the ranch, a letter was waiting on the porch. It was postmarked from a town far to the west. The handwriting was hesitant but clear. "Mr. Morrison," it began. "I don't know if you will ever forgive me, and I don't deserve it if you do. I know now that I was wrong. I let a bad man use my pain against a good one. I have found work on a railroad crew and I am trying to be the kind of man my pa would have been proud of. Maybe one day I will be. Thank you for showing me what mercy looks like. I hope you and your family have found peace. Yours, Luke Henderson. Jack folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. He looked out at the yard where Samuel was teaching the twins how to throw a lasso, and Mary was helping Ruth hang laundry on a line, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. He had promised a dying woman he would look after her children. He had never imagined they would be the ones to look after him.